Hi, I'm Jonathan Lehman, and welcome to this episode of 9 Marks Pastors Talk. 9 Marks exists to equip church leaders with a biblical vision and practical resources for building healthy churches. Mark Dever remains in Australia, as he was in the last episode, yet I have one of the associate pastors here at Capitol Baptist with me, Jamie Dunlop. Jamie, thank you for joining me for this conversation.
Absolutely. Thanks for making time, Jonathan.
And Jamie, I want to talk about a topic that I'm going to confess I wasn't super excited about when you first came to me with the book proposal.
Mm-hmm.
The book that's just out. And that's the topic of church budgets.
Okay, so Jonathan, why were you not excited about it?
Well, I'm like, another confession. When the elders go to discuss church budgets, I tend just to tune out.
I initially in the book had a little sweet note to my wife at the beginning.
Uh-huh.
And she said, could you wait till there's a book that's more interesting to put my name in the front? So you're not alone.
Yeah.
You're
So,
not alone.
okay. Yeah, good. So I'm standing with your wife. But here's the reason
Standing
I'm beginning.
with my wife is always a good place to be.
Smart man, wise man. The reason I'm starting there, though, is to say, as you and I talked about the topic, and obviously as I read your book, Budgeting for a Healthy Church, aligning finances with biblical priorities for ministry, just out by 9 Marks, and Crossway published it. Thank you, Crossway. Zondervan. Thank you, Zondervan. Forward by Tim Challies. Great book. I'm definitely recommending it. What I discovered is, this is not just a boring topic. This is actually a spiritually critical topic. In fact, you say a church budget is a spiritual tool with spiritual aims. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think that's actually not...
That's like on page 2 or 3.
The fact that people don't understand that is what makes budgeting seem so prosaic to so many people.
Yeah.
Jesus taught a lot about money. Why did he teach a lot about money? Not because he wanted a handout, he wanted our hearts, right? He understood that money is important, not because it lasts forever, but because it indicates where our hearts are. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And it's very true for a church as well. The budget matters because it indicates what the church values. And so connected up in that decision, not so much of how you're going to run the budgeting process, but what you're going to fund, connected into that is an understanding of what is the church there for? What's its mission? What is it trying to do? How is it trying to do that? What does Scripture speak? How does Scripture speak into all that? And so pretty quickly, when you get into budget, you realize this is not primarily a financial document or a financial tool. This is a pastoral tool. This is a spiritual document because it's probably the best enunciation of what a church values. Well,
is that what you mean when you say, I hope to show how a church's budget shows its true philosophy of ministry? Why the word true?
No, because so often the vision statement a church puts together may sound great, but be quite different from the reality of the situation. And if you want to understand a church's real philosophy of ministry, I would suggest that you skip past the website and skip past the vision statement, open up their budget, and that'll tell you a lot more about what that church is really trying to do than anything that they might say on their website.
I think of how Mark would often, I remember hearing years ago when I first got to Capitol Hill, Mark preaching about, what's going on in your wallet is exposing you, sort of at the individual Christian level, right? Like, what are you doing with your wallet? Or he would talk about how every time you sign a check to the church in giving, it was like a little declaration of independence from the demands of materialism in my heart, right?
Yeah.
You're kind of saying the same thing for the church budget as a whole. It's revealing what we value. It's exposing who we are and all of that.
Well, it's interesting how often we as pastors say all the things you just said about individuals and yet don't think the same is true of our churches.
Yeah.
And so we end up relegating the budget to the business manager or to the finance committee. And we don't, as pastors, pay much attention to it, not realizing that actually it's a powerful tool to pastor our churches, and it's an important tool to understand if we're going to try to help a church become more healthy.
So the conversation you and I are having right now isn't just a conversation for the budget guy, the church treasurer,
Correct.
the administrative pastor. This conversation we're having right now about church budgets is for who?
It is for the budget person. It is for the finance committee. It is for the deacons. It's for the elders. It's for the main preaching pastor. In fact, one thing I say in the introduction to the book is if you're reading this book because your pastor just handed it to you because you're the budget person, you have my permission to hand it back, unless he'll read it with you. Because so little in this book can actually be implemented just by the budget person. You can't do the stuff I talk about unless you have the pastors, the elders on board.
Because you're trying to impart a kind of collective values as a whole in the book. And if the budget guy is like, well, I think these things now, but none of the other elders are lined up with me, like that's not going to get them very far, basically.
Yeah. And because the budget person is responsible for the budget process.
Right.
But at the end of the day, the church is responsible for the budget. The elders are responsible for the budget.
Okay. So again, I want to talk about this topic more than this book per se,
Yeah.
but help us understand what's the main burden of the book? What are you trying to do in this book? Just so people can know shouldn't buy it.
I'm trying to help pastors understand that if you want to move a church toward health, you have to move its budget toward health. If you want to make the church healthier, you have to understand the way the budget is going to change that. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of pastors are trying to get their churches to be healthier, and they don't realize they've got this ball and chain of the budget, which is pulling them back where they came from, because they haven't understood the connection between church health and really a budget that proceeds out of Scripture. Mm-hmm. And so I want pastors to understand how to use the church budget as a tool. I want them to understand that Scripture actually speaks a tremendous amount to what's in your budget. In that sense, the book it's not a how book, like how, what are the 5 steps for a church budget process. I don't think that church budgeting is that different from budgeting for any other nonprofit. It's a what book, right? It's what biblical principles should change what is in your budget, and what implications does that have for how your church looks and feels and operates. Okay,
to play the skeptic for a second, I can imagine the guy listening thinking, okay, so now 9 Marks is saying the Bible even speaks to what's in our church budget. I mean, come on, really? I understand you guys say membership is there and discipline, but what's in our budget, really?
Not a surprise for someone who's read 9 Marks materials, right? It seems like the Bible's everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, who do you hire for, what staff are represented in your budget? Mm-hmm. Well, both qualifications are in Scripture, but also what those staff are trying to do is in Scripture. Mm-hmm. Are you hiring staff to, go off and do ministry on behalf of the congregation, or are you hiring staff to equip the congregation for mm-hmm. ministry? Mm-hmm. What kind of building are you going to construct? Are you going to construct a building that essentially divides the congregation or unites the congregation? What kind of programs are you going to fund in your budget? Are you going to fund programs that allow the congregation to separate out into all their little niche interest groups and pursue ministry that's comfortable to them? Or are you going to fund programs that, again, bring the church together? You can't separate philosophy of ministry from what's in the budget.
So what should be the goal of a church's budget?
Some people would say the goal of the church's budget is to bring as much money in as possible. Bigger is better. Some people may even put a little spiritual tint in that and say that a bigger budget is evidence of more faith, which I try to lampoon in the book. And I would just point out that God doesn't need our money. Mm-hmm. Again, He's not after our handout, He's after our hearts. Mm-hmm. Some people might say, well, the budget is really about making ministry work for our congregation as much as possible. How do we make ministry in this church to meet people's needs, to make them as comfortable as possible? Which, again, is not a particularly biblical goal for a church. Some people might say that the goal of the budget is to fund as much ministry as possible. The more we can fund the Great Commission, the better the budget is, which is a lot closer to the mark.
I'm like, that sounds pretty.
It sounds pretty
sensible.
Good. Except as you read through Scripture, you discover the church is not simply a means to the end of the Great Commission. In many ways, the Great Commission is a means to the end of something greater, which is the church is the glory of God made visible.
Glory of God.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
And which just reminds you, if you're going to get your budget right, you've got to get the church right.
Yeah.
The two are so connected. So when I answer that question in the book, I go to Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, where Jesus says the goal of all of our resources God has entrusted to us, including the church budget, is to be found faithful. And faithfulness in that passage seems to matter because it's the risk-taking obedience of those two faithful servants that shows off the worthiness of the master. Mm-hmm. Again, the church is there to show off the worthiness of the master. And so the budget is valued based on how well it does that. I think that concept of risk-taking obedience is an important piece of our budgets. Is the budget of your church risking things the world values based on the promises of God through obedience to Scripture?
So it is an act of faith. You are budgeting in faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. When you send your money to a bunch of missionaries in Afghanistan, mm-hmm. the world looks at it and says, that's ridiculous. What mm-hmm. on earth are you trying to do? Mm-hmm. Well, you're trusting that what God says is true, which is that funding that work to see healthy churches in a Muslim majority context is worth great risk.
Okay, so you say a goal of the church budget is to be faithful.
Absolutely. And I try to kind of pull apart what faithfulness is. I think some people...
I was going to say, well, because it looks different. My goal as a father is to be faithful.
Absolutely.
My goal as a citizen is to be faithful. My goal as a 9 Marks worker is to be faithful. But what's unique then about church budgeting as faithful?
Well, two things. The first is, I guess more generally, faithfulness is exciting. Right? In the English language, at least, we use faithfulness to mean boring.
Like, a little bit.
Old faithful, right? Who wants to be old faithful? The old faithful is quite exciting. And so I'm trying to help people understand faithfulness actually it's how we show off the glory of God. How does a budget show off the glory of God? When we think very carefully about how the different sections of our budget can obey the principles in Scripture. And when we think very carefully about how the different sections of our budget can take some risks, can do things the world says are foolish because we see them there in Scripture.
And you're saying this applies to the 10,000 person megachurch mm-hmm. with resources, coming out their ears.
Yep.
And you're saying this to the struggling church plant where the pastor gets his money, a lot of it from the outside, $20,000 a year from the inside, and he's got to live on $60,000 a year, and he's got to raise. So what you're saying applies to both.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Are there differences in how those two churches think about their budget? Like we have a $5 million budget. I don't know, and a 20,000. Mm-hmm. From the standpoint of what you're talking about, it's spiritual priorities, it's spiritual goals. Are there any distinctions? Or are you basically saying, no, look, this is the same?
I think the goals are the same. Now, how you accomplish those goals is going to be very different between those two situations.
Yeah.
How you make those decisions is going to look very different between the two situations. But I think the goal of the church budget, which is that we be found faithful as a congregation, at least at a very high level, is going to be the same.
So if I'm thinking of Acts 6, and I'm thinking of how the apostles are like, hey, look, we got to preach and pray. You deacons, well, I didn't say deacons, but let's find 7 men who are faithful to deacon tables.
Yes.
Isn't a church budget basically something that kind of your more diaconal type person is going to care, the administrators are going to care about, or is it the pastors?
Well, it's interesting. In Acts 6, though the implementation is being done by the deacons, the apostles, the proto-deacons, thank you. Because those deacons eventually they look a little bit like elders, and then eventually we see elders in the Jerusalem church who are not the apostles. And,
right.
Acts 6 it's
tough.
It's the protoplasmic stage of the church. So it's hard to know exactly what's going on.
That may have been the first time the 9 Marks pastors ever had the word protoplasmic used.
All has to do with budgets, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
But
who's leading?
So
The
even in that
deacons
situation,
or the elders?
the apostles, who seem to be functioning as elders, they establish the priorities, right? They say, this is a big problem, apparently because of the potential conflict that's happening, or the apparent conflict that's happening between the Hebrew-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews. The Aramaic-speaking Jews and the Greek-speaking Jews, and they establish the priority of the ministry of the word.
Right.
And so they're establishing the priorities. The deacons then are trying to execute and carry that out.
So you're going to say the pastors should lead.
I would.
Why?
Absolutely.
Why should pastors lead the budget process? Why is it bad? I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
For Jonathan Lehman, in that once a year meeting where somebody brings out the budget and says, okay, guys, time to talk about the budget.
For you to check out.
For me to kind of check out and like, the guy's got the detail guy's got this. I'm more, theology stuff. Why is that bad? Why should elders collectively be thinking about this or leading out in this?
Yeah, a few reasons. The first is because of what the budget is, right? It is the, it's our collective value system really as a church. I give the example, I've used this analogy often, the budget is like a mutual fund. Right? You think of a financial mutual fund, a whole bunch of people pool their money together so they can retire someday, and they send it to a fund manager, and he or she look across the world for the best opportunities to invest that money in ways that fit the goals of the fund. And then when they retire, they expect to see a return on their investment. And the same is true of your budget, right? So all of your members at Chevrolet Baptist Church are putting their money together. They're entrusting you every year with a pretty significant piece of their wealth. And then as pastors, you and the other elders are going to look for the best ways to put that money to work for the Great Commission, to show forth the glory of God through your church. And someday, when your members stand before the Lord, they expect to see a return on that investment. Not a financial return like the prosperity gospel would say, but much more significant, a spiritual return. That's a spiritually fraught process to figure that out. How do we balance between money for children's ministry and money for missionaries?
Yeah.
When do we decide that this missionary their vision is far enough from what we're trying to do as a church, it's time to stop funding them? And how do we do that? This person wants to fund, this amazing wing of the church that has a great youth attraction. Other people are saying, well, gosh, are we funding the Great Commission? Or are we funding, Jesus theme park? Well, again, that's a mission of the church. Who are we? Spiritually fraught question. And the good news is that God has given every church spiritual leadership, which is its elders.
Yeah.
Right? Paul said to Titus that the church planting was not complete until they had elders in those churches. And so those elders meet the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1. And they have been charged, Hebrews 13, with the spiritual well-being of that church. And so the elders are the ideal people, the pastors of the church, to lead them on that journey through a lot of spiritually difficult questions to determine what to do with the money God has entrusted to us.
Okay, so what does pastoral leadership look like? Of the budget process, what does it look like? And I have in mind
the two different churches.
I have the solo pastor church, and I have in mind the Capitol Baptist 25 elders sitting around a table.
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like?
Well, it's look very different in the two churches, right? In some churches, there's not a lot of administrative help. So you may have a deacon or two, maybe some administratively minded people in the church to help, but the elders are doing a lot of the kind of basic level work. Whereas if you're looking at the megachurch with $30 million a year in spending, I hope that the elders are not kind of getting down to every nook and cranny of how many pencils do we buy. I've used this for a long time, but I do talk about 7 different tasks that the pastors need to perform, really in every church, regardless of size. One is the pastors need to be involved in setting the budget's income estimate. Why is that? Well, because when you decide the top line of the budget, you're not merely answering the question, how much are these people going to give next year, current course and speed? You're also trying to think through, are there special opportunities this year? Have we been pushing the congregation recently? There's a pastoral judgment needs to go into setting that income estimate. Number two, it's the job of the pastors, of the elders, to determine if the high-level allocations in the budget are right. So, should we spend 30% on staff, 50%, whatever it is? Or do we need to kind of shift away from staff more toward other things? Or are we spending too much money on missions internationally, and we're undercutting the seedbed of the church instead?
If you're the solo pastor, you're saying you should be making that decision?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. You need to lead the church in this.
Mm-hmm.
It's one reason.
Because it's a spiritual decision.
It is.
Revealing, as you said, the values of your heart.
Yeah. That's one reason why I think if you're a solo pastor, you need to pray hard for other men who are recognized by the church's elders to come around you, because you don't want to do this by yourself.
No,
right?
You don't. That's awkward.
Third task is basic quality control. Mm-hmm. So, are there any items in the budget that we should not have in the budget? Either because they are funding things that are anti-gospel. Hopefully you don't have that, but sometimes you do. Or are they funding things that are actually working against what we're trying to do as a church? Yeah. And sometimes the pastoral question is, well, we're funding this thing. It's kind of contrary to what we're trying to do as a church, but these things take time, so we're not going to fight that battle now. That's a fine answer, but it's a pastoral question. Fourth thing I talk about, balancing long-term plans with emergent opportunities. So I remember having this great building renovation plan we put together for our church, and then one of our former pastors announces he's moving back and wants to plant a church 5 miles from here. We're thrilled because that section of the city needed a church. And so the elders decided, okay, we'll put our renovation plans on hold so we can fund that church. And then we did the same for you. It's been on hold for quite a while. Hopefully eventually get back to the plan.
You're welcome.
But that balancing opportunities we didn't anticipate with our long-term plans is something the elders need to think about. Number 5, I'll go quickly, assessing unique opportunities for ministry. Every church has some opportunities for its budget that they can take advantage of better than other churches, either because of where they're located or relationships they have. In all humility, maybe some areas of competence they have. And it's the elders who need to think through, okay, is this particular opportunity something we should especially take advantage of? Number 6, I think the elders need to communicate the budget. There is so much teaching you can do about money, about values, about faithfulness when you talk to the church about the budget. So I hope a pastor...
You do that at CHBC in members meetings 6 times a year, members meeting. There's a budget update, and you always pastor the congregation. There's always a little nugget of wisdom you offer.
Yeah, because I think it's a wasted opportunity to talk about money without talking about values.
Yeah, well done.
So, in fact, the last chapter of the book, I have my little notes. What do I teach at those members meetings?
Okay, good.
Which is useful for me because now I don't have to, remember so hard. I've got it in the book. I reference it myself.
What did I say?
The last thing pastors need to do is know when to break the budget. There was a financial recession. The money's not coming in. Do we cut staff or do we ask people to give more? There's a really unique opportunity to send out this missionary. We hadn't planned on it. Do we do a special offering? Do we cut somewhere else?
The budget's not the Bible.
No,
it's not
at all. And yet there's some really pastoral decisions that need to go into, do you break the budget and how do you break the budget?
Yeah.
And most churches are going to have that go back to the congregation for approval, but the elders need to lead.
What mistakes do pastors make typically that you're trying to
help
warn against?
Well, you can probably see, I think the biggest one is they ignore the budget. They see it as a financial thing.
Yeah.
I'm not really concerned about that.
I fall into.
I'm the spiritual guy. In fact, I give the example near the beginning of when my pastor, Mark Dever, first came to this church. One of the deacons took him out to lunch and said, hey, I'll cut you the same deal I have with the other pastors. Right? I'll take care of the budget. You take care of the preaching. Well, by which he was being very generous. He was saying, I'm going to make sure the budget...
I'll take this burden off you.
Yes, I'm going to make sure I'm going to give as much as it takes to make this thing work. and I'll control it.
Yeah.
And Mark said, no, I can't do that, right? You can't, you don't have this dichotomy in Scripture between material and spiritual. It's all spiritual.
Right.
So that's one. I hope that pastors...
As evidenced by the fact that Mark, I've heard him say, uses the church budget in his quiet times, praying through different line items of the budget.
What a great prayer
thing.
guide.
Yeah.
Totally. So I hope a budget is involved in praying for the budget, thinking through how the budget comes together. I think another mistake pastors make is the opposite, right? They kind of see it as their own personal fiefdom.
Yeah.
Like, I have my goals for this church, and I'm going to make sure they're represented in the budget. And that's where that mutual fund idea is really useful, that you're investing this money for the glory of God on behalf of the congregation. And so this is not about your personal agenda. This is about what we're doing together as a church.
So you're suggesting a loose grip from the pastor?
I would say good leadership and a loose grip. Yeah.
Now, brother, you were a business guy, right? You're in management consulting for
10 years.
10 years. While functioning as a non-staff lay elder here at Capitol Hill, then you came on staff as a full-time pastor. And the church pays you for that. You have a natural facility and talent with these types of things. And it occurs to me, you strike a balance between, on the one hand, saying, no, this is pastoral work, and therefore it's good for a pastor to attend to it. But on the other hand, I think I've heard you say elsewhere, no, not every church needs an executive pastor. So do churches need executive pastors, or why is it good for an executive administrative guy to be a pastor?
No.
There's a needle to thread there.
Yeah.
Just very briefly.
Well, I joke with people sometimes that I look after the administrative piece of the church because I dislike administration less than the other pastors do.
Okay.
It's not my favorite thing to do. I'd far rather be in a marriage counseling session where things go swimmingly and they, run out holding hands. That's far more satisfying to me than getting the numbers to balance.
Sure.
But I don't dislike getting the numbers to balance. No, I don't think every church needs an executive pastor. Even our church doesn't need an executive pastor. We're kind of on the small end at 1,000 members to have someone who is a pastor who gives a lot of attention to this kind of work. Elders are overseers, and that gives a sense of stewardship over material things. And so I think it's really useful for every church to have at least one elder. They don't need to work for the church, who's the point person on administrative matters, to help the elders think this through. In some ways, that was me when I was a non-staff elder. I was on the compensation committee. I helped put together our budget, worked with the deacon a budget, and eventually I came on the church staff. But even now, I spend probably 20% of my time on administrative matters. I think one danger churches make is they think, we need an executive pastor, so we're going to hire this business guy because he's really good at business and bring him to be a pastor. What they discover is, unless they're a very large church, the churches are just not that administratively complex. And so what they end up with is a guy who's mainly a pastor, who they hired mainly because of his business background. And I would just say, hire a pastor if you want someone on staff to do this, who, by the way, has some good administrative competence.
Yeah, well said.
I think for most churches, that or the non-staff elder who helps particularly take the leadership in this area is going to be more useful than an executive pastor.
Well, brother, I told you I entered this topic a little reluctantly when we first sat down and talked about it a year ago, 2 years ago, whenever that was, and having read your book, benefited from it and enjoyed it, and happily, gladly recommend not just the quote-unquote finance guys, but guys like me who don't naturally gravitate to this topic. In fact, I would say if you don't take these topics in hand, whether through Jamie's book or elsewhere, but your book is so good at this, and if you don't take these topics in hand, you are neglecting part of your oversight, part of the stewardship God has given you in leading out this congregation. So
it was funny. One of your staff, Alberto, looked at the cover, the multicolored cover, and he's like, this is the one ring that rules them all, right? All the 9 Marks colored books, they kind of come together here, which I think is true. It's the budget's what makes a lot of these things work around.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Jonathan.